All right, let's talk about bullshit. Not the casual, everyday kind, but the big stuff. The institutional, weaponized version. The kind that's used to start wars, topple governments, and basically shape the reality you live in.
And who better to start with than the master himself, George Carlin? His whole point was that our biggest problem isn't that we don't have enough information. It's that we refuse to see things as they really are. We'd much rather wrap ourselves in a comfortable story, a narrative that makes us feel good, instead of facing a cold, hard reality.
Because this isn't just about losing an argument on the internet or having an awkward Thanksgiving dinner. We are talking about a fundamental flaw in our brains, a vulnerability that can be exploited on a massive scale, not just to win a fight, but to start a war.
Okay, so it all starts with this biological process, and you've definitely experienced this, even if you don't know what it's called, the amygdala hijack.
So here's what happens. In any heated argument, a biological switch gets flipped. That's the moment the listening just stops and the attacking begins. Your prefrontal cortex, that's the logical, rational part of your brain, it gets completely shoved aside by your amygdala, your little primal threat detector. Suddenly, you're not having a conversation anymore. You're in survival mode.
And a user on Reddit just nailed it perfectly. The original point of the argument, it gets totally lost. The whole discussion stops being about the actual issue and becomes about the emotional reaction to the issue. The substance is gone and all that's left is conflict.
But what if this biological bug isn't a bug at all? What if it's actually a feature? Something that can be triggered on purpose to achieve a strategic goal? Well, this is where personal psychology blows up into full-scale geopolitics. And look, this is not some conspiracy theory. This is a real, declassified document from the CIA. It's an analysis of a Soviet model for influence operations. It is, for all intents and purposes, a playbook, a literal step-by-step guide on how to systematically trigger these emotional hijacks in an entire population to make them believe exactly what you want them to. So how does it work? Well, the playbook boils it down to a pretty simple four-step process. First, you've got an initiator, say the KGB, and they set a goal. Second, they use a channel. This could be a front group, fake documents, friendly media, you name it, to deliver a specific message. Third, that message hits the target audience. And fourth, the goal is achieved, you've hijacked their perception and manipulated their decisions. Simple as that.
Okay, so now let's get into the juicy stuff. Let's see how this playbook was actually run, creating these foundational myths of the Cold War. I mean, we're talking about bullshit so effective it's lasted for more than 50 years.
Let's start with a big one. The official story, the one we all learn in school, is this clean, moral victory, right? The good guys won, the bad guys got punished at the Nuremberg trials, justice was served. It's a simple, comforting story. But the declassified reality? Well, it's a lot uglier. Turns out, U.S. intelligence, we're talking the precursor to the CIA, actively worked with the Vatican to run these covert rat lines. These weren't escape routes for refugees. Oh no. They were for high-ranking Nazi war criminals like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. And why? Because they were seen as useful assets in the new fight against the Soviet Union. I mean, the contradiction here is just staggering. Under programs like Project Paperclip, America was celebrating putting a man on the moon thanks to Nazi scientists like Arthur Rudolph. At the same time, we conveniently ignored that his last gig was managing a factory where thousands of slave laborers were literally worked to death. We built our shining American future on top of their buried crimes.
All right, myth number 2, and this one was a biggie, the idea of a single unified enemy. This image of a global communist conspiracy, a giant red tide, directed entirely from Moscow, just ready to sweep across the world. It was a simple, terrifying picture, and it fueled the Cold War for decades.
The reality, though? Well, as historians like Vincent Bevins have pointed out, this whole idea of a single monolithic enemy was, quote, greatly exaggerated. In fact, the communist world was deeply fractured. The biggest crack, of course, was the massive Sino-Soviet split. And far from being threatened by it, the U.S. saw a golden opportunity.
And the U.S. didn't just sit back and watch this happen. Oh no, they masterfully exploited it. After border clashes between China and the USSR got hot, Henry Kissinger made a top-secret trip to Beijing. And that one trip paved the way for President Nixon's historic visit in 1972, which completely re-engineered the Cold War. It turned our two biggest enemies against each other. Genius, right? So, why does this pattern of deception, of this institutional bullshit, work so damn well and just repeat itself over and over again? Well, for the answer, let's go back to our original diagnostician, George Carlin.
Carlin's diagnosis is just brutal, and it's spot on. Despite our skyscrapers, our iPhones, our art, our fundamental wiring hasn't really changed. We are still running on ancient software. We're operating out of the most primitive, reptilian parts of our brain.
We like to think we're so evolved, right? We write poetry, we compose symphonies, but at our core, we are barely out of the jungle. We are, as Carlin put it, semi-civilized beasts, just with fancier tools to act out our most primal urges. And that is the vulnerability the playbook was designed to exploit. So, if the problem is literally hardwired into our own brains, where do we even start to look for an antidote? How do you fight back when you, yourself, are the vulnerability?
Seriously, where do you even begin when the game itself seems rigged against rational thought?
It starts with asking that one question that nobody wants to ask. What am I doing wrong? The very first step is just awareness. It's turning that critical lens back on ourselves and admitting our own capacity to get hijacked. It means taking responsibility for our own reactions before we can even think about calling out anyone else's.
And get this, there are actual hacks to short-circuit this hijack. As that same Reddit user discovered during a fight, sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is humor. Just seeing the sheer absurdity of a tense situation and laughing, it can act like a lightsaber, just cutting right through that emotional overload. It diffuses the bomb instantly.
Look, in the end, the antidote is a conscious choice. The influence playbook isn't some big secret anymore. The patterns are out there for anyone to see. So the real question is, what happens when you see the hijacking coming, in yourself and in other people, and you just refuse to play the game? Calling out the bullshit really starts with refusing to be its pawn.